Welcome to the History of Interior Design, and welcome to Egypt. I want to introduce the country. I've done this for art history, but I want to do this separately for this class. Now, first of all, where is it? There it is. It's pretty straightforward. What you think of as Egypt today is not ancient Egypt. It's a massive country created basically by European powers. Egypt in the ancient world, for the most part, was a very narrow strip of land surrounding the Nile River, sometimes as narrow as 1 to 5 miles across. The reason is, well, there's not much beyond the Nile River. That's kind of an issue here. The land kind of looks like this. On one side here on the left, this is what they would have called the Red Land, or what we would have called the desert, or would call the desert, I suppose. And then they have the Black Land, which is the fertile land along the Nile. Now, a lot of what you see here, these canals, flood controls, etc., are modern, but the same idea exists. You see the Nile River right there next to the desert. You get places such as, for example, right here, where you can stand 1 foot in the Red Land and 1 in the Black Land, 1 in a land of death and 1 in fertility. Now, that does a couple of things. First of all, it creates a very binary worldview for the Egyptians. Everything is black and white, good or bad, etc., etc. There's always two sides to everything. It also creates a situation where the Nile becomes the center of their world. To them, the universe started with the Nile. Along these edges, now today it's all farmed, but along these edges would have been thick papyrus marshes right along the river itself out here. And that serves as transition. Whenever you see reeds or papyrus, it means a transition from life into death, just like it's a transition from land into water. Now, by the way, the flooding of the Nile is so great that it dumps silt across the land. It creates very fertile land. In fact, Egypt will be the granary to Rome. It's where Rome gets most of its food, most of its grain will come up from ancient Egypt. And it's going to maintain that role until the 1970s, until the Aswan High Dam, and suddenly you don't have the flooding anymore, etc. And it's not just the Nile. We have the same thing in the United States. Along the Missouri River, for example, through the state of Missouri, what used to be the Missouri River is 3 miles wide. Well, obviously it's been channelized now. The Army Corps of Engineers got involved. But all of that floodplain that used to be the Missouri River is now the most fertile land in the United States because it floods regularly and has flooded regularly for millennia. So, same basic idea, but this gives you an idea of who the Egyptians are and how their environment shapes them in a very large, very deep way. Now, there are different periods of Egyptian history. We have the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. There's also the pre-dynastic, the first intercessory, the second intercessory. That's not terribly important. What you do need to know is a couple of very simple ideas. In the Old Kingdom, we tend to see very idealistic people, very strong pharaohs, a strong social hierarchy. There is some trade, but they tend to be actually surprisingly xenophobic. The Egyptians are very isolated from the rest of the civilized world, as it were, at the time. The Middle Kingdom, we see this constant issue of civil war and strife. The pharaoh loses a lot of power in the Middle Kingdom. People are not very optimistic during that period. The New Kingdom, we see optimism redeveloped basically through conquest. The Egyptians are going to spread out of Egypt into the Levant, in other words, the Eastern Mediterranean. We see trade expand. We see an expansion of art and architecture and all of that. But let's talk about Egyptian religion. Of course, it's fairly important. To them, the Nile is the center of the world. Before creation, the world was, to the Egyptians, chaos. The creator god sprang forth and created Shu and Tefnut. They, keep in mind they're siblings, but that happens a lot with creation stories, they in turn give birth to Jeb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, who also forget that they're siblings and give birth to Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Seth. So we're starting to get into gods that you would recognize. Osiris represents the ordered world and civilization. He basically ruled over Egypt. Seth existed as his antithesis. Osiris and Isis would have a son by the name of Horus, who will displace Seth and rule Egypt. Osiris will eventually become the god of the underworld. Consequently, and this is really, really important, when it comes to Egypt, the pharaoh does not represent a god. The pharaoh is not a priest of a god. The pharaoh is God. In fact, the pharaoh, when he's alive, is Horus. The pharaoh, when they die, is going to be Osiris. So the pharaoh is a literal god walking amongst men. The Egyptian pantheon changes over their history, which is long. We're looking at somewhere around a 2,500, 3,000 year history, give or take. And so we see certain gods come into favor, certain gods come out of favor. We see evolutions through the religion. So anyone who tells you, oh, these are absolutely the key gods at all times, that's really oversimplifying the whole issue. So we see a lot of changes through time, both powers, gods' positions. New gods are developed or come from basically nothing to being important, such as Aton, which is a whole different story. Let's talk about the afterlife. Of course, I couldn't help myself. Of course, we have to talk about the body first. And yes, this one looks a lot like a cheesesteak, although it's Nefertiti. So we have mummification, sometimes dadification, occasionally uncleification, but it's a long process by which they preserve the body. As you could imagine in any society, the Egyptians, if you're the pharaoh or high class, you go through this whole process. They use a chemical called natron, which is a salt that they get from a dry lake bed in Libya. And they put the body in there for 70 days if you're very wealthy in the pharaoh. If you're not very wealthy, they kind of throw a bag of Morton salt at you, shove you in the ground, and hope for the best. But mummification doesn't always work. The idea is we want to preserve the body so the soul has a home in this world. Well, as an insurance policy, they also have something called Ka statues, which take the place of the body should the body be desecrated in any way. Now, the Ka statues can be massive stone pieces, they can be more simple clay or plaster pieces, but almost everyone has one in one way, shape, or form. What happens to most of those mummies? Well, a lot of them just kind of decay over time, but many of them will be turned into paint. If you ever come across mummy gray, it's sort of a brown tone. The Victorians ground up mummies to make that. That was pretty cool. They used it to fertilize fields. A lot of mummified cats were used for that purpose. Why we don't continue to use cats to fertilize fields, beyond me. They also take pills with mummy in them in the 19th century because it was supposed to give you energy. I don't ask questions sometimes. But they have these Ka statues. Those will be replaced, and the whole mummification thing will be slowly replaced by the time we get to the end of the Egyptian period during the Romans by these Roman mummy portraits where they paint these on the coffin and then bury the body as you would be used to in the West. But then you have this portrait of who the person is painted on the coffin in wax paint called encaustic, and they last a very long time. They serve the purpose very well. Spiritually, it's a whole different ballgame. Now, when it comes to Egypt, you hear a lot of stories about, no, this is their idea of the afterlife, and this is their idea of the afterlife. It actually changes quite a bit through their history. What we're looking at is from the New Kingdom. This is actually from the tomb of Hu-Nefer. And here we have one view, a New Kingdom view of what happens in the afterlife. Here, Hu-Nefer is being brought to be judged. His heart, symbolized here by this pot, is weighed against a feather. Basically, when this lever is pulled, this balance comes loose, and we see which one is heavier, the feather or the heart. If the heart is heavier, he will be consumed. If the heart is lighter, he goes into the afterlife. Previous to this, pretty much everyone went into the afterlife. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, it's pretty much everyone. There is no idea of salvation or any kind of prize for living a good life. The whole recording is done here, and then he's brought before, here we see Hu-Nefer twice. He is brought by Horus before Osiris with his siblings around him. Above, we have the pantheon of the major Egyptian gods. So this element of judgment is there. That's something that evolves over time. It's not something that's always there. but it gives you an idea of how things change. And for the Egyptians, a lot of their decoration, a lot of their ideas are tied to religion in one way, shape, or form. It's really a key element to their lives.